Sutra, right, into
Yes.
English, and I think he translated it from Burnouf, the French
That's right.
scholar, right?
Yeah.
And if I want to maybe talk about a deeper level of a kind of relationship, maybe. In Thoreau, we have this practice, let's say, of living deliberately, right? This choice to live deliberately. I think there's a whole kind of Western discourse about that, and that too is linked to a kind of freedom, right? So this sort of rejection of family values or social obligations is not just about pursuing pleasure or being a delinquent, right? It's about establishing a way to live deliberately and to cultivate a kind of freedom that I think is not superficially understood, right? I think it's really intimately related to a deep discourse in Western culture about freedom, and I would cite Kant talking about autonomy, right? The importance of becoming an autonomous individual, acting of your own will and accord and with full knowledge and to the best of your capacities. And this linking freedom to that kind of sense of autonomy requires, in some cases, the capacity to separate yourself from the kind of givens, the thoughtless givens, do this, do that, be this, be that, that would constitute ordinary society. So I think in that kind of countercultural vein, there's something more there that's, I think, worth attending to.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that bringing up Kant is very relevant here because he was the one who famously posed the question, what is enlightenment? The famous essay he wrote, in which he basically said enlightenment means the ability to think for yourself and not just take for granted the givens of society. And I agree that that's what Emerson and Thoreau are doing. What I would say is that as far as Asian religions are concerned, they are more indebted to Hinduism than Buddhism in a direct sense. Henry David Thoreau came to believe in a Hindu version of reincarnation. He thought that that karma and reincarnation made a lot of sense to him, and he refers very admiringly to the Bhagavad Gita in Walden. There's a specific passage, I think it's not in your handout, but I just made a separate note of it for me, where in Walden, Thoreau says, "In the morning I bathe my intellect in the stupendous and cosmogonal," whatever that word is, "philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, since whose composition years of the gods have elapsed, and in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seem puny and trivial." So I think that a lot of this idea of freedom and autonomy and being able to question basic assumptions is something that the Hindu influence contributed to. And it has a lot in common with Buddhism. But in terms of a direct influence, I don't think that there was one in that sense. But I think there are areas of overlap that you can talk about.
Right, yeah, it couldn't be an influence. But it's a similarity in theme and trajectory that is, I think, not entirely insignificant.
No, it is. It is very significant because I think that if you start with the Western Enlightenment notion of questioning your common assumptions, that does have some amount of compatibility, at least in terms of the kind of mental procedure involved of the Buddhist epistemology of questioning our granted assumptions about how existence operates, about our assumptions about how we have a fundamental basic self and how the physical world is fundamentally objectively real, and these assumptions that Buddhist philosophy tries to question. So I definitely agree that
they at least both call upon you to enact forms of cultivation.
Yeah. So that's one aspect of this synthesis of the two enlightenments that I think does really go on to a high degree, especially in the 20th century.
I was thinking of recently His Holiness Sakya-Chuzan being here, and when he wrote the Jewel Garland introduction, he made a very interesting point. He said, at the time that the Jewel Garland and the letter to advice to Kublai Khan were written, that Chujapapa and Sakya Pandita were attempting to teach Buddhism to the most powerful and luxurious people in the whole world. And that at that time the Khans had everything that they could possibly have, and their life was very stressful. Obviously, they spent, it was not just luxury, but the amount of internecine warfare and then the actual external warfare and all the difficulties that they had. Their lives were not easy ones. And in these two texts that His Holiness taught and wrote the introduction to, he pointed out that Buddhism is presented first in the beginning of especially the Jewel Garland. It's presented as a way to make your ordinary life more successful and more happy. He said, if you're talking to someone who's already a committed Buddhist, you can begin with the suffering of samsara and the desire to go to enlightenment. But if you're talking to a worldly person who just basically wants more happiness and less trouble, they need to be approached by helping them understand the law of karma, and also how, by practicing these ways, you can get happier ordinary life. And then indirectly, through that, you can then begin to lead them to something beyond this life, to the first Hinayana path, and then the Mahayana path, in the case of the Jewel Garland. So I think it's interesting that in this context in the United States, as you said, Buddhism is being presented to people who want, in many cases, more worldly happiness and more comfort. And so stress reduction and hedonistic ability to focus on the moment. For example, just focus on what you're doing now rather than try to overcome the moment, to perceive it as empty of inherent nature or something. These things are not really being taught. So it's, I don't know, there's just a kind of a similar intersection there, I think, with society.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that it's no accident that the form of Buddhism that is the most popular and well-known in the United States is Zen. And the version of Zen that has become popular in America is a kind that emphasizes a very simple practice of silent meditation with almost no ritual to speak of. And in the Zen American literature that you'll read in books by people like D.T. Suzuki or Shunryu Suzuki or folks of that nature, they tend to focus on using Zen to develop spontaneity and creativity. And they valorize creativity in a way that doesn't really have an antecedent in Eastern thought. Creativity is a pretty, at least in the American entrepreneurial sense, is a pretty Western notion. And a lot of the contemporary mindfulness-based stress reduction programs, which is a kind of mindfulness meditation based on Buddhism, is completely secularized. So there are a lot of relevant ways in which this is going on. And there's actually a guy named Jay Michelson who wrote a book called Evolving Dharma, where he talks about the ethical questions about this. Is it really worth it for people to take some superficial aspects of Buddhism that can make their life a little easier, but without addressing the fundamental issues? And his opinion is that yes, that's a good thing, because at least people are encountering less suffering than they otherwise would, and a lot of the people who are introduced to Buddhism for superficial reasons end up developing a deeper interest later on, which corresponds to His Holiness's pedagogical ideas that you mentioned. So I think that's a very relevant point. Yes, Carl-san.
I guess my question is, so these writers or the authors, so what do you think they mean, like kind of motivation or the goal behind writing this? Or so, because I haven't read any like these books, so when I hear Buddhist American Buddhist literature, I feel like some theme, like common themes like compassion, love, and in traditional Tibetan and also Indian Buddhist literature, Buddhist literature, you see these, right, compassion, love, but here it sounds like, it's more like philosophical, instead of, those basic, I don't know. So it's, so their goal is to make Buddhism more, exotic as they have been doing in the past, or is it they are trying? I mean, they, as a writer, also has a responsibility to engage those and also teach those moral teachings to the readers and as well. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's an especially important question, and I think it can vary a little bit for each writer, but all of the writers that I've been studying are writers who are either Buddhists themselves by affiliation, or even if they don't self-identify as Buddhists, they still feel very positively about Buddhism and try to follow many Buddhist values, and they practice some version of Buddhist meditation. So I think that if there's one common thread throughout all the Buddhist American literature, I would say that it is to impress upon its readers the need to react to adversity with calmness and patience rather than with aggression and irritation. I think that kind of psychological and very practical day-to-day orientation is one common thread that you can see. But as I'm sure you can imagine, it manifests very differently in different ways. So in the Beat generation, the kind of Buddhism that we get there is about thinking of the emptiness of reality in a way that diminishes suffering to some degree, but it still doesn't really focus on the problematic nature of desire. It has a soothing effect, but it doesn't have a transformative effect. But it tries, it just doesn't quite get there. And then in Charles Johnson's case, I think that his goal is precisely what he announces in passage number 6, which is to argue that the Buddhism is actually the fulfillment of the African American civil rights movement. So I think he has a very specific kind of social and political project that he's going for there, to a much greater degree than some of the other Buddhist writers are. But there are many different degrees and ways of having those commitments. But I think it comes back to being a calmer person and being able to change things positively through gentle means.
Do you think it's part of the American Buddhism, though, going to the beats, it seems like so much of what Kerouac and Snyder wrote was as much about the philosophy of Buddhism as about the West and the expansiveness of the American ideal and the breaking out of kind of the industrialized East Coast, especially for Kerouac and for Ginsberg and those folks. And growing up in the East, that was my vision. Buddhism in California or the coast and the ocean was freedom. It was a different mindset. It was more compassion, more love going out there, more freedom to be whoever you chose to be. And that was as much of the philosophy they embraced in order to just be different than the standard philosophy. And I think somewhere in there, if you look at the Native American philosophy, why, you say here why American Buddhism is less ritualistic or less following structure or leaders. It's more to the individual American spirit that people think of to say there are no leaders. It is a collective, or it is the individual who can.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and it's interesting that we would mention Native American religion because Gary Snyder, especially in his later poetry from the 1970s onward, really involves a very interesting combination of Buddhism and Native American religion in his poetry, which is very regionally specific to the American Northwest. And he wrote a collection of poetry called Turtle Island, for example, that uses the name for a Native American name for the American continent because he didn't want to call it America. That was too European. He wanted to be able to develop a different relationship to the land, a relationship that was based on caring and being a part of the land in an interdependent way rather than exploiting and dominating the land, which is more of the mainstream American capitalistic approach. And, you know, in terms of the freedom and the hierarchy and the structure, I think it's very true that Americans have a very hard time accepting religions that are centered around highly authoritative leaders. Those kinds of structures tend to get labeled as cults very quickly. And I think that American Buddhism hasn't done itself any favors by having several very high-profile scandals, especially in the 1980s, that dealt with actions by gurus that would be considered really bad by normal moral standards, especially with people like the regent of Chogyam Trungpa, his primary disciple. And then there were also some Hindu gurus like Swami Muktananda and a few Zen masters whose names I don't recall who have been involved with scandals. And Americans say this is what happens when you put leaders on a pedestal, power corrupts. But then again, some people say, well, yes, but you also are combining this with a particularly American kind of gullibility, where there was this countercultural hunger to just do something different, that they would accept teachers blindly without really examining them too closely because they were so eager to just set themselves apart from the mainstream. So in terms of the counterculture, I think Kerouac is an example of someone who didn't really understand Buddhism that well, but wanted it as a countercultural credential. And that's why he abandoned it in the 1960s when he got tired of it. But on the other hand, Gary Snyder got very serious. He lived in Japan for a number of years, received formal Zen training, and his later writing became much more subdued and less wild as a result. So it's interesting the balance between sincerity and then just counterculture reaction that you can find. So let's see. Any other thoughts, ideas, questions, other book titles that you want to throw into the mix? Yes, Dwayne.
Sorry.
Yeah.
If I may.
Yes.
Can we go back to the Gary Snyder poem?
Of course.
I want to look at the two parts, the two alternating parts that are going on. Starting with the second one, right? Wild geese in the orchard, frost on the new grass. Now, when I first came to that, I've never seen this poem before, but when I first came to that, I immediately thought of Ezra Powell, right? Images. But it goes on. Mare's eye flutters, jerked by the lead rope. Stone bright shoes flick back, angles trembling down steep rock. So the scene's changed, right? We're not in a place where there are apple orchards anymore.
Right.
And we're on a mare. The next part, wet rocks buzzing, rain, thunder, southwest. So this seems to be, I think, a journey west. I think what he's doing here is telling a story about what you said, right? This move from Eastern culture to the West, which is always in American mythology, right? Presented as this land of love, milk, and honey.
Yeah.
Now, we can laugh at that if we want to, but it's as a trope, it's a real thing, right? And it carries meaning. And that's what he's talking about. And he's alternating that, right, with his prayer. Which you can imagine that the next stanza, if there were one, would be another Amitabha vow, right? So we've got this move towards California, let's say, that is going on two registers. On the one hand, it's somebody sitting doing this prayer, right? On one hand, and on the other hand, it's this journey to the West Coast. Now, I think what he's doing here is making those equivalent, right? Like in this poem, going back and forth from one to the other.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, and I do agree that after the first two parts, it seems very disparate, but then gradually it sort of converges at the end, and it's trying to make this...
Wind whips bare legs, we should go back, we don't.
Yeah. And so I do think that the poem is trying to really to sort of map this interior space and the geography onto one another, both at the same time. So yeah, this is And this is what makes Snyder so great, is his poetry is very disciplined, it's very terse, but it's so complex and so structurally well done. And yeah, it is a great poem. And I'm glad you mentioned Ezra Pound, because he was a huge influence on Gary Snyder. And I think that Gary Snyder actually tries to do a better job of handling Asian themes than he thinks that the modernists like Ezra Pound and Ernest Fenollosa did. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of literary history there.
That would be an interesting place to look, wouldn't it? Ezra Pound and Fenollosa.
Yeah, and when I was putting this talk together, I thought, should I talk about the modernists?
Yeah.
And I decided not to, because a lot of what they're doing was more of a continuation of a similar approach that some of the later transcendentalists were taking and some of the later 19th century writers. And I wanted to focus on just talking about the transcendentalist as a bit of a starting point and background, and then jumping to the beats, which is where my own post-1945 project really begins and where the countercultural turn takes place. But I have been studying the modernists a fair amount, and they're definitely an important part of this whole picture. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland is a particularly interesting example, by the way.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth revisiting that poem, looking for the Eastern references.
There are, right, Hindu mostly, I thought.
Both Hindu and Buddhists. Yeah, so the third section of The Wasteland is entitled The Fire Sermon.
Oh, that's right.
And at the end, the last 20 or so lines of the poem do talk about Buddhism a lot too. So it's, yeah, he does some very interesting things with that. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Well, Kyle,